Opal Ford stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas on a Thursday morning in the spring of 1882 with a leather satchel in one hand, a folded letter in the other, and absolutely no intention of marrying a man she had never met without first reading him the terms she had drawn up herself. The town of Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kisham Trail, a place where cattle drives still thundered through the main street, and the dust never quite settled before something else stirred it back up again. It was not pretty, it was not quiet. It smelled of horses and dried mud and smoke from the blacksmith's forge, and when the wind came in off the open plains, it carried with it the particular kind of loneliness that only wide, empty spaces can produce. Opal stood in the middle of all of it, smoothed the front of her blue traveling dress, and looked around with the calm, measured gaze of a woman who had already decided that whatever this place threw at her, she would handle it with both hands. She was 24 years old, tall for a woman of her time, with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned up tightly beneath a modest hat, and brown eyes that noticed everything they looked at. She was not from Kansas. She was from Cincinnati, Ohio, where she had spent the last 3 years working in her late father's dry goods store after he passed, and her 2 older brothers took the shop in a legal dispute that the courts had decided entirely in their favor, leaving Opal with a small inheritance, a suitcase, and the dawning realization that a woman without property in 1882 had fewer options than she cared to admit. She had answered the advertisement in the Cincinnati Gazette herself. She had not been pressured into it by a desperate mother or a scheming aunt. She had read the words with clear eyes, folded the newspaper neatly, and written back with a letter that was 3 pages long and drafted with the same careful attention she had once given to inventory lists and supply orders. The advertisement had been placed by a man named Raymond Archer of Caldwell, Kansas, who described himself as a cattle rancher of 31 years, widowed, in possession of a working property, in need of a wife who could manage a household, and was prepared for frontier life. He had specified honesty over beauty and practicality over sentiment. Opal had written back saying she was honest, she was practical, and she was very much available, but that she had 3 conditions of her own which she intended to present in person, and that if he found them unreasonable, then neither of them needed to waste any further time on the matter. She had received a 1-line reply that said, "Fair enough. Come on out. Raymond Archer." Now she was here, and the man himself was supposed to be meeting her at the stage depot. She looked up and down the wide, unpaved street of Caldwell. There was a general store, a saloon whose sign hung slightly crooked, a land office, a barber shop, a hotel with a porch sagging at the left end, and a woman sweeping the boardwalk outside what appeared to be a dress shop. There were men on horses moving at various speeds through the street, and somewhere in the distance a dog was barking at something that had probably long since stopped caring. Raymond Archer was not hard to identify when she finally spotted him. He was leaning against the post of the stage depot, with his arms folded across his chest, and his hat pulled low against the morning glare. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than the advertisement had led her to imagine, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar, and a jaw that had not seen a razor in at least 2 days. He wore a plain work shirt, dark trousers, suspenders, and boots that were worn but clean. He was watching the stagecoach passengers disembark with an expression that she could only describe as carefully neutral, which she respected more than she would have respected false enthusiasm. She walked toward him directly. He straightened when he saw her coming, pushed the brim of his hat back with one finger, and looked at her with eyes that were a particular shade of gray-green, the color of sage just after rain. "Miss Ford," he said, not a question. He had figured it out the moment she walked toward him like she owned the street. "Mr. Archer," she replied, and she held out her right hand. He shook it, and she noticed that his grip was firm but not aggressive, which was something she had learned to pay attention to in men. "Your journey was all right?" he asked. "Long," she said honestly. 4 days from Cincinnati with a change in St. Louis and a bad night in Wichita. But I am here now and I am well, so we can consider the journey done." He nodded. He picked up her traveling trunk from where the driver had deposited it in the dust and hoisted it onto the back of a wagon that stood waiting nearby without apparent effort. "I thought we might get breakfast before anything else," he said. "There's a decent place on the main street, the hotel dining room." "That would be welcome," Opal said. "And after breakfast, Mr. Archer, I would like to give you something to read before we discuss any further arrangements." He glanced at her sideways as he helped her up onto the wagon seat. "The counteroffer," he said simply. She looked at him with something close to surprise. "You knew I was bringing one. You warned me in your letter that you had conditions," he said, climbing up on the other side and taking the reins. "A woman who has conditions doesn't just say them out loud without having them written down proper. That's not a counteroffer kind of woman. That's a woman who came prepared." He flicked the reins and the horse moved forward. "I respect that." Opal Ford settled herself on the wagon seat, looked out at the wide Kansas morning, and felt something she had not expected to feel so soon. She felt, cautiously, that this might not be as terrible as it could have been. The hotel dining room was simple and clean, with 4 tables covered in oilcloth and a window that looked out onto the main street. A woman named Mrs. Prout who ran the hotel served them coffee without being asked, which Opal immediately liked, and eggs with biscuits and a small crock of butter that was better than anything the stage stops had produced in 4 days. They ate in a companionable silence for a few minutes, which was a thing Opal had not expected. Most men she had dealt with in her life felt an obligation to fill silence with noise. Raymond Archer ate his breakfast and looked out the window at the street moving past and seemed perfectly content to let the quiet sit there undisturbed. When the plates were cleared and fresh coffee was poured, Opal opened her satchel and produced a folded document that she had prepared on clean paper in Cincinnati the week before her departure. She placed it on the table and smoothed it flat with both hands and slid it across to him. He did not reach for it immediately. He looked at her first. "You want to tell me what's in it, or you want me to read it cold?" "Read it cold," she said. "I want to see your honest reaction." He picked it up and began to read. She watched his face carefully. It was a controlled face, not given to easy expression, but she was good at reading faces and she caught the small things. His eyes moved steadily down the first page. His expression did not change dramatically, but there was a slight shift around his mouth when he reached what she suspected was the second condition. Not displeasure exactly, more like recalibration, like a man adjusting the weight of something he was carrying so he could carry it better. The document was 3 pages long, written in Opal's clear, precise handwriting. The first condition was that she would retain control of any money she brought into the marriage, and any money she earned independently, which she intended to do by establishing some form of business, the nature of which she had not yet decided. She was not prepared to be financially dependent, and she was not prepared to be financially invisible. This was 1882, and the legal situation was what it was, but she wanted his word on it before any other agreement was made. The second condition was that all decisions about the ranch that were significant, by which she meant financial, structural, or affecting the welfare of anyone who lived and worked on the property, would be made with her full knowledge and input. She was not asking to run the ranch. She was asking to be treated as an adult partner rather than a decorative domestic fixture. The third condition was the one she had written last and revised the most. She wanted time. She was asking for a 3-month period after her arrival in which they would live in the same house, work alongside each other, and come to know each other as actual people before any ceremony took place. If at the end of 3 months either of them found the arrangement impossible, she would take her trunk and her inheritance, and they would part on civil terms with no obligation owed in either direction. He read all 3 pages without interrupting. He turned the last page over, saw that the back was blank, and set the document down on the table with the same careful attention with which she had originally placed it. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a wagon loaded with lumber rolled slowly down the street. Then he said, "She will do just fine." Opal blinked. "I beg your pardon." "I'm saying it to myself," he explained, and his voice had a quality to it that she did not quite have a word for yet. Not warmth exactly, but something that was what warmth was before it fully arrived. "When I put that advertisement in the paper, my neighbor Bill Sutter told me I was wasting my time. Said any woman with sense and options wouldn't come out to a cattle ranch in Kansas unless she was desperate, and a desperate woman wasn't what this place needed." He picked up his coffee cup. "I told him I was looking for a particular kind of woman. He asked me to describe her, and I couldn't do it exactly. Just said she'd know herself when she got here." He looked at her steadily across the table. "Now she's here and she's handed me 3 pages of her own terms and she's watching my face to see if I flinch." He set the cup down. "She will do just fine." Opal looked at him for a long moment. Something was shifting in her chest, something she was not ready to name. "You agree to the conditions?" "To all 3 of them, yes," he said. "The money thing I should have thought of myself. That's fair. The decisions thing I can work with. I'm not so proud that I can't use a second set of eyes. And the 3 months," he paused. "The 3 months is the smartest thing on that page. You don't know me. I don't know you. 3 months is reasonable." She had prepared herself for negotiation. She had not prepared herself for simple, immediate agreement. "There is one thing I would add," he continued, "which is that I have a hired hand named Colt Deaver who has been with me going on 5 years. He runs most of the day-to-day operation of the ranch. He is rough around the edges, but he is honest and hardworking, and he gets a vote on matters that affect the ranch. Not a veto, but a voice. I just want that to be known from the front." "That seems entirely reasonable," Opal said. "Good." He picked up the document and folded it with the same care with which she had written it. "I'll keep this if you don't mind." Seems like the kind of thing worth keeping. She did not know why that made something inside her settle the way it did, but it did. The Archer Ranch lay about 7 miles southwest of Caldwell, reached by a trail that cut through open grassland broken here and there by creek beds and scattered stands of cottonwood trees that stood like sentinels along the water. The land was vast in a way that Opal had understood intellectually from maps and descriptions, but had not fully grasped until she was sitting in the middle of it, looking at a horizon so flat and distant that it seemed to belong to a different kind of world than the city she had come from. The ranch itself was better than she had expected. The main house was a solid 2-story structure built from timber and plastered adobe, newer than many of the buildings she had seen in town. There was a proper porch running the length of the front, a kitchen garden to the side that was currently more weeds than plants, a barn, a bunkhouse where Colt Deaver apparently slept, a corral with 5 horses, and a second smaller pasture that held a milk cow and 2 pigs. Colt Deaver was waiting by the barn when they pulled in. He was 40 years old and built like a fence post, lean and weathered and obviously skeptical. He had a face that looked like it had been left out in the sun for about 10 years longer than strictly necessary, and he regarded Opal with the particular expression of a man who had watched his employer make decisions he didn't fully agree with and was reserving judgment on the latest one. "Miss Ford," he said, with a nod that conveyed acknowledgement without enthusiasm. "Mr. Deaver," Opal said pleasantly. "Mr. Archer tells me you're the one who actually keeps this operation running. I'll be trying to learn from you when you have the patience for it." Something in Colt Deaver's expression shifted slightly, the way a door shifts when you push it and it turns out not to be latched. He had clearly expected something different. "Well," he said after a moment, "that kitchen garden's been a problem. If you've a mind to tackle that, it'd be more useful than most things." "Then I'll start there," Opal said simply. Raymond watched this exchange with his arms folded and his hat in his hands. When Colt walked back toward the barn, Raymond turned to Opal and said, "He's never said that much to a new arrival in his life." "I asked him a question he knew the answer to," Opal said. "People like being asked questions they know the answers to. It makes them feel competent." Raymond looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize as his version of being impressed. It did not announce itself loudly. It was quiet, like most things about him, but it was there. He carried her trunk upstairs and showed her a room that was clean and plainly furnished with a rope bed, a chest of drawers, a washstand, and a window that looked south toward the open plains. There was a quilt on the bed that was clearly handmade and clearly old. She ran her hand over it without thinking. "That was Aliner's," he said from the doorway. His voice was even, but it cost him something to say it. Aliner had been his wife. She had died of a fever 18 months ago after 3 years of marriage. They had not had children. He had told Opal this in a letter briefly, without apparent self-pity, and she had respected that economy of grief. "It's beautiful work," Opal said quietly, and she meant it and nothing more. He nodded. "I'll leave you to get settled. Supper's at 6. Colt eats with us most nights, just so you know." "I'll be down," she said. The first 2 weeks passed the way the first weeks of a new life always do, in a sustained effort to understand the rhythms of a place that is completely foreign to everything your body knows. Opal woke at 5 in the morning, which was not a great departure from what she had done in Cincinnati, but for entirely different reasons. She learned which boards on the kitchen floor creaked and which ones didn't. She learned that the wood stove ran hot on the left side and needed to be banked differently than the stove she'd grown up with. She learned that Colt Deaver took his coffee black and without conversation before 7 in the morning, that Raymond preferred his eggs fried rather than scrambled, and that both men came in from the morning work smelling of horses and leather and fresh air in a way that was actually not unpleasant. She tackled the kitchen garden with focused energy, pulling weeds and turning soil and working out what had been planted there before and what the ground would support. She found seeds in a tin in the pantry, beans and squash and turnips, and she planted them in rows she measured with a piece of string tied between 2 sticks. She mended the fence around the garden using wire and a technique her father had shown her that was more practical than pretty. She made a proper inventory of the kitchen pantry and the root cellar, wrote out a list, and presented it to Raymond one evening after supper. He looked at it across the kitchen table. "You want to take this into town?" "I'd like to go myself," she said. "With you, if you have business in Caldwell, or alone if not. I want to know where the general store is and what they stock and who runs it. I'll need to know these things." "I'll take you Saturday," he said. "I need to see the land agent anyway." Caldwell on a Saturday was a different creature than Caldwell on a Thursday morning. The Kishom Trail cattle season was beginning, and the town swelled with drovers and trail hands coming off the cattle trails with several months of wages and an energetic desire to spend them. There was noise and color and movement on every street corner, and the saloons were full before noon. Raymond moved through this environment with the calm competence of a man who had navigated it 100 times. He introduced Opal to the proprietor of the general store, a broad-shouldered man named Otto Hensel, who shook her hand and told her that her predecessor, which was his word for Aliner, had been a good customer and a fine woman. "She was," Raymond agreed simply, and moved on. Opal bought her supplies, and then, while Raymond was at the land agent's office, she spent 20 minutes looking at the empty storefront next to the dress shop. It had been a harness maker's once, to judge by the smell, and the previous tenant had left a workbench and several shelves along one wall. She pressed her face to the dusty window and looked at it for a long time. When Raymond came back, she was still standing there. He followed her line of sight. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking about a lending library and dry goods shop," she said. "Nothing large, but there's no lending library in Caldwell. Every town of any size in the East has one. Drovers come through here with money and time and nowhere to spend the evening if they're not drinking. Settlers come through with families. Women come through who need practical goods. I could order books and stock some of the household items that Otto doesn't carry. Thread, fabric, medicines." She turned to look at him. "It would start small. I have enough from my inheritance to open it modestly. I'm not asking for your money." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the storefront. "That space has been empty 8 months, he said. "Tom Weir at the land office handles it. He'd probably deal fair." He paused. "It's a good idea, Opal." It was the first time he had used her given name. They both noticed it. He looked at her with an expression that was as close to surprised as she had yet seen on him, as though it had come out before he had fully decided to say it. "Then I'll talk to Mr. Weir," she said, and her voice was steadier than the thing happening somewhere in her chest had any right to be. She signed a lease on the storefront 2 weeks later. She spent the following month cleaning, painting, and outfitting the space with a combination of her own labor and money, several trips to Wichita for book stock, and the occasional assistance of Colt Deaver, who turned out to be an extremely competent carpenter when given both the materials and the excuse. "You don't have to do this," she told Colt one afternoon when he was building the last of the shelving from pine boards she had purchased. "Nothing better to do on a Thursday afternoon," he said, which from Colt Deaver was roughly equivalent to a declaration of enthusiastic support. The shop opened on a Tuesday in May 1882 with a simple painted sign over the door that read Ford's Books and Goods, and 11 people came in on the first day, which was more than Opal had dared hope for and less than she hoped for eventually. Mrs. Prout from the hotel was first through the door and spent 45 minutes and left with 3 books and a length of calico. A group of trail drovers came in out of curiosity and left 2 of them with dime novels, which made Opal reconsider her initial decision not to stock them. Raymond came in at the end of the day just as she was closing. He looked around at the shelves, at the neat rows of books and the orderly arrangement of goods, and he stood in the middle of it with his hat in his hands and looked at it all. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "You've built something," he said, and his voice had that quality again, the one she still didn't have a complete word for. "We've been here 6 weeks," she said, coming around the counter to stand near him. "At the end of 3 months, if you find this satisfactory, I would be pleased to stay permanently." He turned to look at her in the fading light of the late afternoon coming through the front window. "I already know I find it satisfactory," he said. "The question is whether you do." That stopped her. She had been so focused on making herself indispensable, on proving her value, on establishing the terms she had laid out in that counteroffer, that she had not fully considered that he might be the one uncertain about his own answer. She looked at him carefully. "You're afraid I'll leave," she said. He held her gaze. "You're a capable woman, Opal. You could run that shop and live in town and do perfectly well without a cattle ranch and a widower 7 miles down a dusty trail." "I could," she agreed. "But Mr. Archer, capable people are allowed to want things beyond their capabilities. I can run a shop. I also want a home. I want a partner. I want children someday if that's possible. I want to watch something grow over years rather than months." She paused. "I want to stay." Something in his face moved. It was not something she could easily describe later, but it was real and it was significant, and she saw it happen. "Then stay," he said quietly. That was the evening things changed, though neither of them made a dramatic declaration about it. They rode home together in the wagon as the sun went low over the Kansas plains and turned the sky a color between gold and copper that Opal had never seen in any city, and they talked for the full 7 miles about nothing of particular consequence. The garden and which of the horses had a tender shoe, and whether Otto Hensel's price on lamp oil was going to hold through the summer. It was the most comfortable conversation Opal could remember having in years, the kind of conversation that did not require effort because the company itself was easy. Colt Deaver was already asleep in the bunkhouse when they got back, and Raymond unhitched the horse while Opal went in and put the kettle on the stove. When he came into the kitchen, she had tea ready and there were biscuits left from dinner still warm in their cloth. He sat down across from her at the kitchen table, and they drank tea by lamplight, and the Kansas night made its particular sounds outside the window, and neither of them was in any hurry to end the evening. He told her about his family that night, sitting at that kitchen table. He was from Missouri, the second of 4 boys, and his father had brought them west when Raymond was 12 because the farm in Missouri was too small and too tired to support the family adequately. His father had died of a heart ailment when Raymond was 22, and his mother had gone back east to live with his older brother. He had come to Kansas at 25 with enough money for a land claim and the stubborn conviction that the Kishom Trail economy was not going to last forever, and the smart play was cattle ranching rather than depending on the trail trade. He had been right, and the ranch had grown steadily over 6 years. He told her about a leaner without much preamble, simply the way honest people describe loss when they have had time to carry it. He had met her in Caldwell at a church social. They had married within 6 months, and they had been happy together in the plain and practical way that people who work hard and respect each other can be happy. The fever had come fast and gone faster, 3 days from the first symptom. He had been holding her hand when she died. He was quiet for a moment after that, and Opal did not fill the silence. Then he looked at her across the table and said, "I put that advertisement in the paper because this house was too quiet and I was tired of being practical about everything. I wanted someone to talk to." "I'm here," she said simply. "You are," he agreed, and the way he said it wrapped around something in her chest and held it quietly. The morning of the 2-month mark arrived on a particularly fine day in early June when the plains grass was tall and green from the spring rains, and the sky was an absolute unself-conscious blue. Opal was in the kitchen garden tying the bean plants to their stakes when Raymond came around the corner of the house leading 2 horses saddled and ready. "Where are we going?" she asked, straightening up and pulling her gloves off. "I want to show you the North Pasture," he said. "The full extent of it. You've been making decisions about this place for 2 months and you haven't seen all of it yet." She looked at the horses and then at her garden and then at him. "Give me 10 minutes to change into the riding clothes." She had bought herself a practical riding skirt in Caldwell the 2nd week. Practical being a relative term in 1882, but at least less dangerous on horseback than her traveling dress. She came back out in 10 minutes and he held the horse's head steady while she mounted, which she did competently enough that she saw him register it with approval. They rode north across the main pasture, through a gate, and out into the open country that made up the larger part of the Archer land. It was different out here than it was around the house and barn, wilder and less shaped by human hands. The grass rolled in waves when the wind came through it, like water, and there were meadowlarks calling from somewhere she couldn't see, and the sky went on in every direction until it met the earth at a distance that felt almost theoretical. Raymond rode beside her and talked about the land as they went, pointing out the creek boundaries and the fence lines, and the places where the grass was best, and the places where the cattle gathered naturally in the heat of the day. He talked about cattle management, about the difference between the Texas Longhorns that came up the trail and the Hereford breeds he had been buying and introducing to improve the herd, about the water rights issue with the neighboring property to the east that had been an ongoing negotiation for 2 years. She asked good questions and he answered them, and they rode for 2 hours in the June sun and came back with her cheeks pink from the wind and her hair escaping its pins in every direction, and a feeling in her chest that she could only compare to the feeling of finishing a book that she had loved, that quality of completion that is also in some measure a new beginning. That evening, she sat at the little writing desk in her room and wrote a letter to her friend Dora Barnes in Cincinnati. Dora was the one person in Ohio who had written back when Opal announced her plan with anything other than concern or disapproval. Dora had written, "Tell me everything and write often." Opal wrote several pages. She described the ranch and the town and the shop. She described Colt Deaver's carpentry and Mrs. Pruitt's habit of recommending every book in the shop to her hotel guests, whether she had read them or not. She described the kitchen garden and the horses and the quality of the Kansas sky at sunset. She described Raymond Archer at the end, briefly, in language that was more careful than everything she had written before it, as though she was choosing each word with the awareness that they might give something away. She wrote, "He is not what I expected, which I believe is the best thing I could say about a person in my situation. He is steady. He is quiet in the way that things are quiet when they are solid all the way through. I believe I am in the process of falling in love with him, and I have not yet decided whether this is inconvenient or wonderful, though I am beginning to suspect it is both. She sealed the letter and addressed it and did not reread it, which was how she knew she had said the true thing. The trouble, when it arrived in the form of two men named Garrett Sims and his associate Denny Webb, who rode onto the Archer property on a Wednesday afternoon in late June, claiming to represent a land acquisition company from Wichita that was buying up grazing rights along the creek corridors. They were polite about it, which made Opal trust them less rather than more. Polite men who show up unannounced with legal-sounding papers and casual smiles are a particular type of polite that has more to do with getting what they want than with any genuine regard for the person they are being polite to. Raymond was out on the north pasture when they arrived. Opal was at the ranch house, having come back from the shop early to tend to the kitchen garden. She greeted them on the porch with a calm face and civil words, and told them Mr. Archer was expected back within the hour if they cared to wait. She offered water and they accepted it, and while they waited on the porch bench, she went inside and looked at the papers they had handed her. The language was dense with legal terms, but she had spent 3 years in her father's dry goods store handling contracts and supply agreements, and she was not unfamiliar with the architecture of a document designed to look more complicated than it was. What she read made her stomach tight. The papers were not simply about grazing rights. There were clauses buried in the middle sections that, if agreed to, would give the Wichita Company easement access to a corridor of land that ran directly across Raymond's water access from the Eastern Creek. Without that creek access, the North Pasture cattle operations would be severely compromised. She was still standing at the kitchen table reading when Raymond came in through the back door. "There are 2 men on the front porch," she said without looking up. "I saw the horses," he said, going to the basin to wash his hands. "What are they selling?" "They say grazing rights, but there's a water easement buried in the middle of it," she said, and she walked to him and laid the papers on the counter beside the basin. She pointed to the relevant clauses, here and here, and this section at the bottom of page 3, which essentially gives them the right to relocate the easement boundary at their discretion. He dried his hands and picked up the papers and read what she was pointing to. His jaw tightened in a subtle way. "How long have they been here?" he asked. 40 minutes, she said. "I told them you'd be back shortly. I didn't want them to leave before you'd seen this." He looked at her, not with surprise exactly, but with something that was very close to it. "You figured this out in 40 minutes. My father signed a bad contract once with a supply company that had a relocation clause," she said. "He lost 2 months of business over it. I have not forgotten what those clauses look like." Raymond folded the papers and took them with him out to the porch. Opal watched from the doorway as he had a calm but direct conversation with the 2 men that lasted about 10 minutes. She could not hear all of it, but she could see the body language. Raymond standing with his arms at his sides and his voice level. Garrett Sims shifting slightly on the bench, and then standing and becoming more animated. At the end of it, Raymond handed the papers back to Sims and said something in a clear, final tone, and the 2 men got on their horses and rode out. When Raymond came back in, he stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. "They wanted to argue about the water clause," he said it was standard language. "It is not standard language," Opal said. "I told them the same thing. Also told them I'd be consulting with the land agent before agreeing to anything with anybody." He looked at her steadily. "Opal, if you hadn't been here today and looked at those papers, I might have set them aside until I had time and they might have come back with a more pressured approach." "Then it's useful that I was here," she said simply. He walked across the kitchen and did something he had not done before. He put his hand on the side of her face very gently, just for a moment, just the flat of his palm against her cheek. It was brief and it was quiet, and it said more than 2 months of conversations had managed to say. "Yes," he said softly, "It is very useful that you are here." She covered his hand with hers for just a moment before he lowered it. They stood in the kitchen a little apart from each other, and the late afternoon light came through the window, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "I should see about supper," she said finally. "I'll help," he said. And that was how they made supper together for the first time, moving around each other in the kitchen with a new and careful awareness that was very much like the beginning of a dance. The 3-month mark arrived on a Saturday in late July, which was convenient because Saturdays meant Raymond had to go to Caldwell anyway for the weekly business at the stock pens, and Opal had the shop to open. So they rode into town together as they had taken to doing every Saturday, and the 3 months was discussed not with formality or ceremony, but simply and directly over coffee in the hotel dining room after the morning business was done. "You said 3 months," Raymond said. "I said 3 months," Opal agreed. "You want to stay," he said, not quite a question. "I want to stay," she confirmed, "and I want to do it properly. I want to actually marry you, Raymond, not just continue an arrangement." She paused. "If that is what you want as well." He was quiet for a moment in the particular way that meant he was sorting through something careful before saying it. "I want more than an arrangement," he said. "I have for a while now. I didn't want to say so before the 3 months were up because I didn't want you to feel like the terms were changing." She looked at him across the table. The morning sun was coming through the hotel window, and it caught the gray-green of his eyes, and she felt something that was warm and clear and absolutely certain moving through her. "The terms we agreed on still stand," she said. "I will keep my shop and my independence and my voice in decisions about the ranch. I am adding to those terms, not replacing them. I am adding that I intend to love you properly and for a long time, and I would like for you to do the same." His expression did something that she had never seen it do before. It opened up. Not extravagantly, not the way some people's faces declare things, but in the way a window opens when you push it, and the room fills with something that was outside. "I already am," he said. They were married the first Saturday of August 1882 in the small Methodist church on the east side of Caldwell. Reverend Caulfield performed the ceremony. Mrs. Pruitt and her husband attended. Colt Deaver came in his good shirt with his hair flattened with water, and stood up straight in the front pew with an expression that was not exactly sentimental, but was very much invested. Otto Hensel and his wife came, and the woman from the dress shop whose name was Ada Prentice, and who had become something like a friend to Opal over the summer, and a handful of other Caldwell residents who had come to know Opal through the shop. There were no flowers from a garden because nothing Opal had planted had bloomed yet, but there was a bunch of sunflowers that Raymond had cut from the wild growth along the creek that morning and tied with a piece of string, and when he handed them to her outside the church before they went in, she thought they were the most honest and genuine bouquet she had ever been given. The ceremony was short and unremarkable in its form because it was 1882, and ceremonies of this kind were brief and plain. But when Raymond said the words, he said them looking directly at her with those steady gray-green eyes, and when she said her own words, she meant every single one of them. And Colt Deaver made a small sound in the front pew that could have been a cough but was probably not. Afterward there was a small gathering at the hotel with pie that Mrs. Pruitt had made and coffee, and some of Raymond's best whiskey for the men. And Ada Prentice hugged Opal, and told her she had done the whole enterprise of mail-order marriage a great deal of credit, and Opal laughed at that, in a way she had not laughed in a long time. Late that evening when they drove home along the familiar trail in the dark, the plains were enormous and quiet around them, and the sky was so full of stars that it seemed extravagant, profligate with beauty the way the wide open country sometimes was. Raymond drove one-handed, and his other hand found hers on the seat between them and held it, and they rode home like that through the Kansas dark. The autumn that followed was the best kind of busy. The cattle season wound down and the drovers moved on, and Caldwell went back to its quieter self, and the ranch settled into the rhythms of fall work, fence mending, and hay storage, and the particular set of tasks that needed doing before the Kansas winter arrived, which arrived with opinions and with force. The shop was doing well enough that Opal had started ordering a slightly wider selection of goods and had hired a girl named Lucy Travers, who was 17 and quick-minded, to help on Saturdays. She had also taken to hosting a small reading circle on Wednesday afternoons, which had begun with 3 women and had grown to 7, and which was the source of more information about the town of Caldwell than any newspaper could have provided, because the women of a frontier town know their community in ways that do not make it into official records. Through the reading circle, she learned that the land acquisition company that had sent Garrett Sims and Denny Webb to the ranch in June was indeed attempting to consolidate water access along the creek corridor, and had already gotten 2 smaller landholders to sign agreements that were, as Opal had suspected, not in those landholders' best interests. She brought this information to Raymond, and he brought it to a meeting of the local Farmers and Ranchers Association, and the result was a collective legal consultation that ultimately blocked the company's attempt at the Caldwell end of the corridor. Sims and Webb were not heard from again in the county, which was a satisfying ending to that particular chapter. Raymond watched all of this with a feeling he found difficult to articulate to himself, but made a sustained effort to do so, because he was not a man who liked leaving important things uncatalogued. He had expected, when he placed that advertisement, to find a practical woman who could manage a household and hold a conversation and be a reasonable companion in the long project of ranch life. He had not expected to find someone who read legal documents on his behalf and built a business and ran a reading circle that turned out to be the social intelligence operation of the whole county. He had not expected to find someone whose opinion he wanted on every matter large and small, and whose presence in any room he entered he immediately felt, like a shift in the quality of the light. He had been in love before with a leaner, and that love had been real and good, and he would not diminish it. But this was different in a way that was not about better or lesser, but about scale. Eleanor had been his partner in the daily work, and he had been glad of her and grieved her genuinely. Opal was his partner in everything, in the daily work and the larger vision and the occasional moments of pure unearned joy that appear in a life if you are paying attention. And the feeling was large enough that sometimes he stood in the middle of a pasture, or at the kitchen stove, or in the church doorway, and simply let it be what it was without trying to put it anywhere. He told her some of this one evening in October when they were sitting on the porch after supper watching the last of the sunset go out of the sky. Not all of it, because some of it was still sorting itself into words, but some of it. "I want you to know something," he said, and she turned from the sunset to look at him. "I know you came out here with conditions and a plan, and a very clear-eyed view of what you needed and what you were prepared to do. I don't want you to ever think that I see that as something to manage around or something that made things harder." She waited. "You made everything better," he said. "Every single part of it." She looked at him for a long moment in the October dusk, with the cooling air coming down from the north and the last thin streak of orange on the western horizon. Then she reached over and took his hand where it rested on the arm of the porch chair and held it. "You gave a woman you had never met the honest courtesy of reading her terms and agreeing to them without argument," she said. "On the first morning. You had no idea who I was or whether I was reasonable or whether any of it was going to work, and you sat across a table in a hotel dining room and read 3 pages of my demands and said she will do just fine." Her voice was steady, but it held something underneath that was not entirely steady. "Do you know how rare that is? Do you know how much of the rest of my life I had before that had been about negotiating for basic recognition?" He turned his hand over and held hers properly. "I knew the kind of woman I was looking for," he said. "I just didn't know yet that she'd come with a 3-page document." She laughed, which surprised her, which made her laugh more. He laughed too, which was something she was still learning to love, The way his laugh came from somewhere genuine and without performance. The Kansas winter arrived in November and made its usual arguments about the wisdom of living on an open plain. The temperature dropped to levels that required serious planning, and the wind was unignorable, and the cattle had to be managed against the cold with a combination of windbreaks and supplemental feed, and the kind of sustained daily attention that Raymond and Colt Deaver provided without complaint. Opal kept the shop open 3 days a week through the winter, which was all the traffic warranted in the cold months, and spent the other days at the ranch. She had by this point fully taken over the management of the household in a way that reflected her own organization, rather than a continuation of whatever patterns had been there before, and the result was a house that functioned smoothly and felt lived in a specific and personal way. She had brought some books from the shop to the house, and they lived now on a shelf in the sitting room alongside Raymond's few agricultural texts. She had embroidered curtains for the kitchen windows using thread from the shop stock. She had moved the furniture in the sitting room slightly and added a lamp near the armchair where Raymond tended to sit in the evenings, so he could read without straining his eyes. He noticed each of these things. He did not make announcements about them. He simply absorbed them into the texture of his days, and the house became more than a place he lived and less like a place he was waiting in. On Christmas Eve of 1882, which was a Sunday, they had a small dinner with Colt Deaver and Mrs. Prout, who had come out to the ranch in her husband's absence, her husband having gone east to visit family. Ada Prentice came with her young son, who was 8 and full of the particular energy of a child who has been promised something. Opal had made a proper Christmas dinner with a roasted chicken, which was what they had, and bread and potatoes and a pie that was Raymond's contribution, which surprised everyone including Opal, and which turned out to be perfectly acceptable. After the guests had gone and Colt had retreated to the bunkhouse, and the dishes were done, Raymond disappeared into the small room off the kitchen that served as his office, and came back with a package wrapped in brown paper tied with a piece of ribbon. Opal was sitting by the fire with her feet curled under her and a cup of tea going cool in her hand. "That's not from the shop," she said, looking at the ribbon. "No," he agreed, sitting down on the chair across from her and holding it out. "Mrs. Prout helped me with the ribbon part. I am not naturally skilled at ribbon." She took it and opened it carefully and found inside a leather journal good quality with a clasp on the front, and a set of 5 pencils in varying degrees of softness, and a small folded note. The note said, "For the woman who writes everything down properly. The pencils are so you can draft things first. R." She looked at him across the firelight with something full and entirely honest in her expression. "I have nothing for you," she said. "I thought we agreed not to exchange gifts this year." "I know," he said comfortably. "I changed my mind. Raymond, you've given me the whole year," he said simply. "That counts." She crossed the room and sat on the arm of his chair, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned her head against his, and they sat like that in the firelight while the Kansas winter made its noise outside, and the house held them warmly, and the fire burned steadily down. The spring of 1883 came in with more mud than beauty, but it came, the way spring always comes on the plains, with a kind of irresistible insistence that the ground gives way, and the grass comes up whether you're ready for it or not. Opal's kitchen garden came back with the beans and squash she'd planted the previous year, which had seeded themselves over the winter, and she added to it this year with more ambition, 2 rows of tomatoes, herbs along the south-facing fence, and a small bed of marigolds purely for the pleasure of the color. In April, she told Raymond she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning, which was not dramatic or planned, simply the moment when she was certain enough to say the words. She had been certain for about 3 weeks, but had spent those 3 weeks in the particular private negotiation that comes with information of that magnitude before you share it with the other person it belongs to. He was at the table with his coffee and the ranch ledger open in front of him. She sat down across from him. He looked up. "I'm expecting a baby," she said. "In October, I think." He put his coffee cup down very carefully on the table, which told her exactly how large the information was to him. "Opal," he said, and his voice had something in it that she did not have a word for because it was too many things at once. "I'm well," she said. "I feel well, and I intend to continue working and managing both the house and the shop for as long as it is sensible to do so. I'll need to find Lucy Travers more permanent hours at the shop, and I'll want to speak to the doctor in Caldwell soon, but none of that is urgent today." He looked at her for a moment. Then he got up from the table and came around to her side, and he crouched down in front of her chair so they were at eye level, and he took both her hands in his and he said, "Are you happy?" It was the question she had not known she was waiting for. Not "are you all right" or "is everything fine," but "are you happy?" "Very," she said, and her voice did something at the end of the word that she couldn't entirely control, and his expression opened the way it had in the hotel dining room the morning she had asked him to marry her, completely and with nothing withheld. He put his arms around her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and they stayed like that for a long moment in the spring morning in the kitchen, with the coffee going cold on the table, and the ledger open and forgotten, and the light coming through the yellow curtains she had made. Colt Deaver, when told, said, "Better get the roof of the upstairs bedroom looked at before the summer rains then." He paused. "Congratulations." He said the last word with such obvious effort that it was more touching than any elaborate expression would have been. Raymond patched the roof of the upstairs bedroom himself the following Saturday, which Opal watched from the garden below with her hand shading her eyes, and when he came down the ladder and she told him he had missed a section on the south edge, he went back up and did it again without complaint, and she thought that this was one of the things she loved most about him, the way he just did the thing without making it a negotiation. The summer of 1883 was long and warm, and the ranch did well. The Hereford cattle Raymond had been bringing in were showing good results, and he sold a portion of the herd in August at prices that were satisfying enough that he could invest in a new water tank for the north pasture, which was the infrastructure improvement he had been planning for 2 years. Opal managed the shop from a stool behind the counter in the later months, and the reading circle continued through the summer in the back room of the shop on Wednesday afternoons, which was now also attended by a young Mexican woman named Elena Fuentes, who had come to Caldwell with her family, and whose English was excellent, and who read faster than anyone else in the group. Opal was aware that Caldwell was not always a welcoming place for people who were not white and Anglo, and she was aware that her reading circle was not going to solve that problem, and she was also aware that she was in a position to make her own corner of this town a place where Elena Fuentes was not only welcome but valued. She also knew that the inequities of the frontier were layered and long-standing, and that acknowledging them did not undo them. She did what she could do from where she was standing. Elena Fuentes told Opal one afternoon in September that her family was considering leaving Caldwell because the treatment in some quarters of the town made daily life difficult. Opal went home that evening and told Raymond about it. He was quiet for a moment and then said that Elena's father, whom he had met twice, was a skilled farrier and a fair man, and that there was a cottage on the eastern edge of the Archer land that had been empty since the previous hired hand left, and that if the Fuentes family wanted to settle there and Eduardo Fuentes wanted steady work as a farrier on the ranch, the offer was open. Opal looked at him for a long moment. "You're not doing this because I asked you to." "No," he agreed. "I'm doing it because it's the sensible and decent thing to do, and my father raised me to know the difference between the two." He paused. "Though the fact that you told me about it is not irrelevant." Elena Fuentes told Opal the following Wednesday, with a calm dignity that was more moving than tears would have been, that her family had accepted the offer. Eduardo Fuentes turned out to be not only a skilled farrier, but a man with a genuine understanding of horses that complemented Raymond's ranching approach in ways that became apparent within the first month, and the Eastern pasture operation improved measurably for having him on it. The baby came in October, as Opal had predicted, on a Tuesday afternoon during a light rain. He was a boy. He arrived, as Raymond described it later to Colt Deaver with understated reverence, like he had somewhere important to be and was not going to wait around. He was healthy and loud about it, and the doctor from Caldwell who had come out for the birth said he was as fine a specimen of infant as he'd seen in the county all year, which was the kind of compliment that a Kansas doctor in 1883 could offer, and which Raymond took with appropriate pride. They named him James Edward Archer. James for Raymond's father, who had brought the family west and built the foundation of what the ranch was now. Edward was Opal's father's name. Raymond held James for the first time while Opal was sleeping, sitting in the chair by the bedroom window with the rain still coming down outside and the baby asleep in his arms. And the expression on his face was one that Opal later said she had not been awake to see, but that she somehow knew the content of perfectly, because it matched something she felt herself. The winter of 1883 to 1884 passed with the particular domesticity of a house that has a new infant in it, which is its own form of adventure. Opal managed the shop from home for 2 months, which was to say she made lists and wrote orders and sent messages with Lucy Travers, who had by now essentially been promoted to acting manager and was performing the role with complete competence. James was not a difficult baby, but he was emphatically present, and the household reorganized itself around his requirements with the cheerful practicality of people who are glad of the disruption. Colt Deaver came in from the bunkhouse one evening in November and stood in the kitchen doorway looking at Opal feeding the baby, while Raymond worked on the ledger at the table, and something was on the stove that smelled of beans and salt pork, and he said, with the expression of a man who is saying something true that he has been carrying for a while, "This is a good house now." "It was always a good house," Raymond said without looking up from the ledger. "It's better now," Colt said firmly, and went back to the bunkhouse. Opal met Raymond's eyes over the baby's head, and they shared the kind of look that does not require commentary. The years between 1884 and 1887 moved with the accumulating richness of a life that is going well in the way that real lives go well, which is not without difficulty or setback, but with the underlying current of satisfaction and togetherness that makes difficulty navigable. The ranch continued to grow. Raymond added 2 more hired hands, brothers named Pete and Daniel Ockafer, who were black cowboys from Texas with excellent horsemanship and a practical approach to cattle management that quickly made them indispensable. The integration of the Archer Ranch workforce was not without friction from some quarters of the Caldwell community, but Raymond's response to that friction was a combination of steady indifference and clear financial demonstration that his operation was doing well precisely because of the quality of his people, which eventually spoke louder than the objections. Opal watched this and felt proud of him in a way that was specific and grounded in observation rather than in romantic idealization. She had known from the first morning that he was a man of genuine fairness. She had accumulated 2 years of evidence since then. She had a daughter in the spring of 1885. They named her Clara Rose Archer, the rose after the wild roses that grew along the creek in June and that Opal had always loved. Clara was born into a household that already knew how to do this, which made her arrival calmer than James's had been, and she was a calm baby in any case, the kind of child who looked at the world with wide, interested eyes as though taking careful notes. James, who was a year and a half old, regarded his sister with the philosophical resignation of someone who has been informed that a significant change is coming and has decided to process it on his own timeline. The shop in Caldwell had, by 1886, expanded into the adjacent storefront, which had become available when the previous tenant relocated to Wichita. Opal now operated a proper lending library on one side and a dry goods and haberdashery operation on the other, with Lucy Travers running the dry goods section with complete authority and a girl named Marguerite helping with the library. The Wednesday reading circle had grown to 15 women and met in two groups on alternating weeks. One morning in the summer of 1886, a young woman arrived at the shop with a traveling bag and a look of quiet desperation that Opal recognized with the particular accuracy of someone who has been in transit toward an uncertain future. The woman's name was Harriet Sable, and she had come to Caldwell in response to an advertisement of her own, similar to the one Opal had answered 4 years earlier, placed by a rancher northeast of town. The rancher, when Harriet arrived, had turned out to be significantly older than his advertisement had implied, and had made clear within the first hour that his expectations of a wife were primarily domestic in nature, and entirely without consultation or partnership. Harriet had walked out of his ranch house with her bag and walked into Caldwell and found Ford's Books and Goods because it had a friendly sign and a woman's name on it. Opal sat with her in the back room and listened to the whole thing, and then she thought for a moment, and then she said, "Can you keep accounts?" "I was a bookkeeper in St. Louis," Harriet said with some surprise. "Then I need you," Opal said. "The shop is beyond what one person can manage well, and I need someone who can run the financial side. The position pays a fair wage, and there's a room above the shop that the previous tenant left furnished. It's not glamorous, but it's yours if you want it." Harriet Sable stayed in Caldwell. She ran the financial operations of Ford's Books and Goods with a precision that freed Opal to focus on expansion and curation, and within a year had made herself as indispensable to the shop as Colt Deaver was to the ranch. She also, over the course of several months, made the acquaintance of Pete Ockhaffer, the Archer ranch hand, and the acquaintance became a friendship, and the friendship became something neither of them had entirely expected, and the wedding in the spring of 1888 was the best attended event in Caldwell that year. Raymond and Opal stood together at that wedding watching Pete and Harriet take their vows, and Raymond's hand found the small of Opal's back and she leaned into him slightly. And the thought she was having was something about how one good thing leads to another if you create the conditions for it, if you extend the kind of honest welcome to the world that allows the world to extend itself back. She told him this later as they rode home through the prairie evening. He listened and was quiet for a moment and then said, "You showed up with a counteroffer. That started most of it." "You said she will do just fine," she reminded him. "That started the rest of it." He smiled, which he did more freely now than he had 4 years ago, and the smile looked exactly the way she had always felt it would if she could see all the way through his reserve to the man underneath it, which she could now, thoroughly, and with profound gladness. By the summer of 1888, the Archer Ranch was one of the most productive operations in the Caldwell area, and Raymond had been approached twice to stand for the County Agricultural Board, which he had declined once, and accepted the second time on the condition that Opal would advise him on matters of community welfare and resource distribution, which was a condition she was extremely pleased to meet. James was 4 years old and asking questions about everything with an energy that suggested he was going to be either a lawyer or a scientist or possibly both. Clara was 3 and had developed the serene confidence of a child who has always felt entirely secure, who moved through the world as though it was fundamentally a welcoming place, which Opal took as the most complete evidence that they were doing the parenting reasonably well. Colt Deaver, who was now 46 and showed no signs of either slowing down or becoming more talkative, had been given a portion of the ranch land on the western edge, as part of a formal agreement that Raymond had drawn up and Opal had reviewed, and both of them had negotiated with Colt in a kitchen table conversation that had taken 3 evenings, and produced a document that Colt signed with the deliberate seriousness of a man for whom this was among the most significant moments of his life, though he would not have said so in those words. He built a small house on his portion of the land over the following year, doing most of the work himself on weekends, and with the help of Eduardo Fuentes and the Acafer brothers. It was a modest house, one room and a kitchen and a sleeping loft, built with the same careful competence that Colt brought to everything. And when it was done, he stood in front of it with his hands on his hips and an expression that Opal privately described as the most satisfied she had ever seen on any human face. The Reading Circle by 1888 had become the Women's Community Association of Caldwell, which was not a formal organization in any legal sense, but which functioned as one, organizing collective purchasing agreements for household goods, maintaining a small fund for families in difficulty, and hosting an annual community gathering in the fall that had become a fixed point in the Caldwell social calendar. It was at the fall gathering of 1888 that Raymond gave a short speech, which was not something he had been planning to do, and which surprised Opal considerably when he stood up. He said that the Caldwell community had changed significantly in the years he had been part of it, and that most of the changes he had seen up close had started with people being willing to look honestly at what was needed and extend a hand rather than a condition. He did not look at Opal while he said this, but she felt the direction of it as clearly as if he had. He said that the kind of town worth living in was the kind of town that welcomed people on the basis of their character and their contribution and their willingness to be present, and that he believed Caldwell was becoming that town. He sat down to more applause than he had expected, and the applause appeared to make him somewhat uncomfortable, and Opal took his hand under the table. On the way home that evening, with James asleep against Opal's side and Clara asleep in Raymond's arms and the wagon moving through the autumn dark, Opal said, "That was a fine speech." "It was short," he said. "The best ones usually are," she said. He looked at her in the moonlight that was coming across the plains. "Are you happy?" he asked. The same question he had asked her the morning she told him about James, the question that had been his form of checking in on what mattered most. "Very," she said, which was the same answer she had given then and which remained entirely true. "Are you?" He thought about it in the honest way he thought about things, not performing the answer but actually considering. "Do you remember the letter I sent you after your first one?" he asked. "The one that said, 'Fair enough, come on out.'" "I've kept it," she said. "I wrote 5 different replies to your letter," he said. "The first 4 were longer. I kept trying to say the right thing. The 5th one I just said what I meant, because that's what your letter had done, just said what it meant directly and without decoration, and I thought I should do the same." He paused. "I've been trying to do the same thing every day since, say what I mean, be what I am." "And are you happy?" she asked again softly. "More than I knew was available," he said simply. The Kansas night spread itself around them, enormous and still and full of stars. The same sky that had been there before either of them arrived in this wide, flat country. The same sky that would be there after they were gone, indifferent to human arrangements but somehow serving as a backdrop against which human arrangements revealed their own significance. The wagon rolled on through the dark toward the lights of the ranch house, which were the lights of a home that had been built, not found but built, out of a 3-page letter and an honest agreement and 2 people who had the good sense to take each other seriously from the first morning. James stirred against Opal's side and settled again without waking. Clara made a small sound in Raymond's arms, and he adjusted his hold without breaking the rhythm of the wagon. Opal looked at the lights of the house coming closer through the dark and felt something that was layered and complete and not simple to name, which was how she had come to understand happiness worked in practice. Not a single clean emotion, but a texture made of many things together. The smell of the night air on the plains, the weight of a sleeping child, the warmth of the man beside her, the knowledge of the home ahead, the shop in town with its books and its generous small purpose. The years behind them and the years ahead, and the specific particular gladness of having been the kind of woman who showed up to a new life with her terms written down clearly on 3 clean pages. She had written those pages in Cincinnati on a November evening 6 years ago with her father's old pen, at the kitchen table of the apartment she had been preparing to leave. She had written them carefully and without apology, and she had carried them 2,000 miles on a 4-day journey to hand to a stranger in a Kansas hotel dining room. And the stranger had read them and been quiet for a moment and said she will do just fine, and had meant by it something much larger than simple adequacy, had meant by it a recognition that she could not have known then was the beginning of everything. The wagon pulled up to the house and Raymond brought the horses to a stop and handed Clara to Opal so he could climb down, and then he reached up and took both sleeping children so Opal could descend. And the transfer of small, warm sleeping bodies between them was so practiced and easy that it was nothing. It was simply a thing that happened, and it was also everything that their life together looked like up close. He carried James and she carried Clara up the porch steps and into the house and upstairs to the children's room, where they lay them in their beds in the lamplight with the quiet efficiency of people who have done this many times. James settled into his pillow without waking. Clara opened her eyes for a moment, looked at her mother's face, and closed them again. They came downstairs and Raymond went to bank the kitchen fire for the night, and Opal checked the back door and the latch on the window and went through the small routine of closing the house up. And when she came into the kitchen, he had already put the kettle on because he knew she would want tea before bed as she always did. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at him in the lamplight, this man who had put that advertisement in the Cincinnati Gazette because he was tired of being alone, and the house was too quiet. This man who had agreed to 3 pages of conditions from a woman he had never met because he recognized something he needed when he read it. This man who had held her hands in the kitchen the morning she told him about James, and who had given a small and honest speech at the fall gathering, and who put the kettle on because he knew she would want tea. "I want to write Dora Barnes tomorrow," she said. "I haven't written in a month." "Tell her she should visit," Raymond said, setting 2 cups on the table. "You've been saying that for 2 years. She keeps saying she will," Opal said. "One of these times she'll mean it. When she does, she can have the spare room," he said. "It's been empty long enough." The kettle began its slow approach to a boil. Outside, the Kansas night continued its enormous quiet, interrupted only by the distant sound of a coyote somewhere out on the open plain, and the wind moving through the grass with the patient persistence that was its nature, and the creak of the house settling into the cool of the late evening. Raymond sat down across from her, and they waited for the kettle together, as they had on 100 evenings before this one and would on 100 evenings after it. And Opal Ford Archer, who had arrived in Caldwell on a Thursday morning in the spring of 1882 with a leather satchel and a counteroffer, and no intention of becoming anything less than herself, looked at her husband across their kitchen table and felt the full weight and warmth and absolute completeness of the life they had made together. And she thought that the woman who had written those 3 pages in Cincinnati had done a very good thing, and that the man who had read them and said she will do just fine had done an equally good thing, and that the rest of it, all the years and the children and the shop and the reading circle and the evenings and the mornings and the long wide Kansas in between, had been the natural and inevitable result of 2 people being exactly honest with each other from the very first moment. The kettle reached its boil. Raymond poured the tea. The lamp burned steadily. The children slept overhead. They sat together, and the night held them, and the life they had made held them, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything a life is supposed to be when it is lived properly, with open eyes and honest terms and a willingness to say the true thing across a table to the person sitting opposite you in the morning light, and trust that if they are the right person they will read it clearly and know what it means. And Raymond Archer, who had put that advertisement in a Cincinnati paper on a Tuesday in October 1881, because he needed something he couldn't quite name, who had written 5 drafts of a reply letter and sent the shortest one because it was the most true, who had stood at the stage depot on a Thursday morning and watched a woman in a blue dress walk toward him across the dust of the Caldwell street with a satchel in one hand and a letter in the other, and the look of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Raised his teacup and looked at her across the familiar kitchen table and said nothing at all, because nothing needed to be said, and the silence between them was the particular, comfortable silence of two people who have said everything important and kept none of it back, and built the whole of their shared life on that foundation of honesty and chosen regard. Outside the window, the stars of the Kansas plain were extraordinary in their numbers and their brightness, as they always were on a clear autumn night this far from any city, and the land stretched away in every direction toward a horizon that seemed, as it always did from here, like the edge of a world that was still being made, still in the process of becoming what it was eventually going to be, wide and difficult and full of possibility. Inside the house it was warm and the lamp was lit, and the children slept above them, and the tea was hot and everything was, at last and completely and with nothing remaining to be resolved, exactly right.